Dogman doesn't hibernate. Goodbye January. Hello February. Dogman doesn't care how bad the weather gets. He's got another all Dogman special. And it starts right now. Dogman doesn't hibernate. Dear Scary Stories, NYC. My wife Cheryl and I are longtime listeners but first-time contributors to your channel. This is about the time we saw a Dogman. It happened about a year ago when we both went on our trek across America, which got shortened into our trek across Pennsylvania for reasons I'd rather not get into. We had been lent an old school but decent condition recreational vehicle by a close relative after we expressed the notion that we felt cooped up working from home for so long. He said that if we had to work in our home, we should take our home on the road. And for the most part, it was a very fun time for me and Cheryl both. There are some issues that can come up when you're on the road that might not in a permanent home though. And one of those issues is the North American upright walking canid, or Dogman. So Cheryl and I had been staying in an RV park just off the southeast edge of Lake Erie, and we were getting ready to leave for our next destination early in the morning as the snowstorm was starting. Technically it was supposed to be dawn, but I wasn't seeing the light where I was, and it was so cold that I was wishing Cheryl would have let us get a few more hours sleep. Still, there's an amazing quality to being up and out at a time and in a place where so few other people are. That's the upside of it. Now let's get to the downside. It was snowing lightly, but growing heavier. I was not looking forward to driving in that weather, but it was either that or fork over whatever amount it was in rent to stay where we were a little longer. I was basically ready to go, but Cheryl told me to wait for her. She was doing something or fixing something, and then she wanted to ride up front with me. So I was just sitting there looking out all around in front of the cab, and I saw this dog off in the bushes. I didn't think too much about it. I figured it was a stray pet or something, you know? It's just something you see. The only reason I even remember it is because of what happened next. I saw the dog, or canine, stand up on its hind legs, and it was holding or carrying something in its front legs. I mean, it was using them as arms to cradle something. I couldn't really tell what it was. It might have been its baby, or it might have been some food of some sort, or it could have been any number of other things, really. It was about as big as a bread box, whatever it was that it was carrying. I just stepped behind a bush with it, and then I couldn't see any of this any longer. The entire incident may have taken 3 or 4 seconds, maybe not even that long. I mean, I noticed the dog messing around behind the bushes probably for a few minutes, but then it's standing up on its hind legs and carrying something behind that tree. That part was just a few quick seconds and over. My wife came up to the cab, sucking down black coffee, excited to meet the day, barking out our itinerary. Then after a while, she realized I was staring out the windshield and not reacting to anything she was talking about. Even after she asked me what was going on, it took me a while to be able to find the words to explain it all to her. I remember pointing at the tree that I saw the Dogman walk behind for some time before finding any words to use as descriptors. Cheryl was playing charades, shouting out words I might have been thinking, trying to guess why I was behaving in such a stunned and disoriented manner. Cheryl was not helping things by shouting out guesses, though. It was making it harder for me to think. I remember pointing to the small bit of woods nearby where we were parked and asking her to just watch, which we both did for several minutes. We watched, and all we saw was trees, which were becoming more and more covered with snow. My wife mentioned how we had better start driving soon, but before she could finish the sentence, something surprised her so much that she shouted like a banshee. I looked where she was looking, out the windshield, and I saw it again. It was just for a second, but I saw it again. It was the upright walking Dogman, and once again he was carrying something the size of a bread box with him in the morning gloom and snow. I grabbed my camera, and I was about to open that door and run after the creature, trying to get a video of it. I really was in that place in my mind. Snow can make me like that. I wanted to make my own Patterson-Gimlin film of me running after the monster. So why didn't I? Because Cheryl, once she saw the Dogman, started shouting at me to get us out of there. I never saw her so scared in her life, and she lived for 5.5 years in Philadelphia. She usually seems pretty tough and streetwise, but once Cheryl saw that Dogman, and he was way off like 300 feet away in the trees, she just wanted us gone from there. And it was not a request either. This was mandatory. She was about as scared as my wife can get, and so I just drove us out of there and onto the highway, heading toward our next destination. So, the downside is I never got to make my own Patterson-Gimlin film of the Dogman, and I am not internet famous. The upside is that my wife hasn't divorced me yet, and that's always a good thing. When the weather gets warmer again, we're thinking of possibly taking the RV out on the road for the spring and the summer. We prefer to spend the winters away from the woods these days, though. And that's because Dogman doesn't hibernate. In the annals of executive producers, some are winners or losers. But of the best, we must list CS, and so that is why we introduce her. Or him. Please join us in thanking today's executive producer, CS. In exchange for their kindness, CS gets to see our weekly uncensored scary Dogman stories far too wild to run on this channel, as well as our over 21 hours of archived Dogman stories, soon to have a new chapter added. In addition, they get to see our episodes in advance of the general public whenever possible, and so can you. Just join our PayPal subscribers club at peterbernard.com, or else do what CS did and click that join link under this or any of our videos to become a Scary Stories channel member. International TV spokesmongrel Henry Lee Dogman will be along at the very end of this show to fill in any deets I may have left out. But now, sit back and get your popcorn ready, because we've got one super long uninterrupted collection of Dogman stories for you, starting right now. Nobody believes the story I'm about to tell you, most of all me. These are the ravings of a lunatic and a madman, yet what I'm about to tell you is exactly how I remember things happening the day I saw two supposedly mythical predators battle ferociously right in front of my very eyes. This is a story from the 1970s when I took a few years off after college to quote-unquote find myself. It's what all the in kids were doing back then. Only I took it very seriously, and I went searching in more far-off places than most people would. As we say now in the 21st century, I went completely off the grid, and I stayed there for almost a year and a half. When I returned to civilization, I had a beard that all my friends made fun of me for. There was a TV show back then called Grizzly Adams, and that became my new nickname. I did get to see a grizzly bear one time, and fortunately it was pretty far off. I once had a real fight with a hungry bobcat, and I got torn up pretty bad, but it came out alive. I just missed getting bitten by a rattlesnake, and I kicked it in the head by accident as I freaked out in reaction. To be honest, I'm lucky I made it out alive there too. There was a time when I was hiding in the Bankhead National Forest in northern Alabama, living there. It's around an hour and a half north of Tuscaloosa, and I guess about 2.5 hours south of Nashville. I'll tell you what though, it can be hard to tell the boundaries of that forest since most of the area that people live in around it is still pretty forested. I kept moving to a new place to camp each night and foraged for food during my days. I never got any hassle from the rangers, who I would wave to when they passed by. Technically, I wasn't really living there, I was just living, and I happened to be there while I was doing it. I don't see how that could possibly be wrong in anyone's eyes. So let's jump to the big scene. I was camped out and sleeping when something woke me up. I caught the tail end of a scream that sounded like it was right outside my tent. I want to say a woman's scream. To be honest, I just know it was the scream of someone or something. Sometimes big cats can sound almost human when they cry in the night, and I wondered if one of them had wandered into my camp. If so, he must be hungry or else deranged and sick. All at once I was shaking all over. I remember the feeling of absolute fear gripping me. That scream had been loud. It was like deep sleep one second, awake and shaking all over the next. I wanted to poke my head outside the tent, but I was too chicken and opted to sitting as still as I could manage instead. I remember listening as intently as I ever had and wondering what would come next. All my attention was to the left of the tent where I had heard the scream. I heard nothing at all now, but I knew something was about to go down. From behind me, with zero warning, came a roar. That was different from the scream. This was not the same thing that had screamed to my left. This was something else that had roared to my right. I wondered what could be going on since both of those sounded like the cries of a predator, not prey. Was I sleeping in the middle of a turf war? Was I about to be drawn into it? Now I was listening to all directions around me, not knowing what was happening. In front of me was the tent flap, so inviting. I wanted to go outside and see what was happening so badly, but I had no weapons with me other than a Swiss Army knife, of which I think I had the corkscrew drawn to use for defense if necessary. I am not ashamed to admit that I got on my knees and in my head I silently prayed. I apologized for all my sins and asked for permission to make amends with anyone I had wronged. I prayed for this little battle outside to move elsewhere. Weeping as quietly as I could, I sat with my back against the tent. Never had I felt so powerless before. It was all entirely out of my control. I had to just pray that I wasn't going to get hurt tonight. And then, something poked me in my back through the tent, and I screamed and went flying through the tent flap and running across the field, almost tripping and falling down the side of the steep hill. I found a tree and hid behind it, peeking out. That was the first time in my life that I ever saw a Sasquatch. And the last time too, at least so far. So yeah, anyone can see a Sasquatch peeking out at him from behind the tree. But it takes someone like me to be peeking out from behind a tree at a Sasquatch. There he was. A giant, hairy man, just like they say. I don't remember much in the way of details, as I was in absolute horror and convinced that I was about to die. Also, this was a long time ago. Anyway, it looked like a man in the face, a primitive man. It didn't look like an ape, except its fur was very much like an ape's fur. I never thought it was a gorilla or a chimp. It was too tall and it stood almost as straight as a human. It was definitely something we would call Bigfoot. He was carrying my bag of food with him. I used to tie my food up in a plastic bag and hang it up from a tree higher than any of the local animals should be able to reach. I wanted to keep my food out of camp in order to prevent bears from wandering in and eating all of it. Anyway, this Bigfoot had taken all my food down and was eating it like popcorn. I had various kinds of nuts and berries that grew locally and a big bag of sunflower seeds that I had bought a long time ago. He was making an absolute mess of everything and eating my entire stash while he seemed to be looking around for something. I was pretty sure I knew what it was. I had been cooking a fish that I caught earlier and it probably smelled for miles. I had finished it though, and all that was left were some bones. He finished all the berries and whatever he found edible in my bag, then focused on searching even harder for the location of the fish. That's when I heard that roar again from behind me. I dropped to the ground immediately. I couldn't believe the Sasquatch wasn't the one who had made that roar. I was looking directly at him and then heard the roar behind me. I held as still as I could, and from my position behind the tree, I really couldn't see anything at all. Then, incredibly loud, I heard the scream again. That was the sound the Sasquatch made. It was deafening, and my heart was beating like a tiny bird's heart. I felt like I was going to die even if none of these impossible things ever touched me. The fright of the situation was impossible to endure. It was excruciating. I wanted to run, but knew I was better off just making myself as small as possible and waiting for this situation to play itself out. and that's what it did all right, as this freaking Tyrannosaurus of a marsupial dog monster animal came smashing out of the forest to my left, and I literally held onto the tree in front of me. This thing shook the ground so much when it moved. I could hear these two monstrosities screaming at each other like kaiju, and I figured the battle was over my fish. Why didn't they just catch their own? They had to know where the water sources were around there. The food was not that scarce, after all I had been living off it. Suddenly I felt a bit guilty. Had my diet impeded on theirs? In my defense, neither of these things were supposed to even exist, so how could I know? I peeked out from behind the tree and witnessed the most vicious fight I hope to ever see. It was 10 times that modern UFC kind of fighting. These animals were not bluffing, and they were not just looking to get the other to back down. For some reason, my camp had become ground zero in a turf battle between two very desperate and humorless-looking beasts. The Bigfoot was taller, but the dog-headed roaring beast walked bent over with his tail held out behind him. To me, that was probably a marsupial that just looked like a dog. It was sort of like a running kangaroo with a larger head and huge saber-like fangs. It had claws, but its arms were very short compared to the Bigfoot. I guess that's why it made me think of a tyrannosaur. I'm trying to imagine it in my mind, and I think it had arms as long as a human's proportionally, but don't hold me to that. Definitely the Bigfoot had the advantage in terms of reach, but he didn't seem to use it. The Dogman was lunging at the Sasquatch's throat, going straight for the kill from the word go. He would get a hold of the Bigfoot's arm and just snap at it. The Bigfoot fought back in much the same way when I thought he really should have been using his massive arms. The Dogman had all the momentum, and the two rolled around on the ground, stirring up dust and screaming a lot. The Bigfoot seemed genuinely surprised at the ferocity of the upright walking canine, and he soon beat it off into the forest. The Dogman chased him, made sure he was gone, then went to work making an absolute mess of my camp. Dogman tore nearly every one of my earthly belongings to absolute shreds, and I couldn't do anything but watch him do it. The needless destruction really annoyed me. It seemed unnatural and a waste. They say only humans destroy for no reason, but that night, I saw some utterly pointless destruction carried out by that werewolf or whatever it was. But I consider myself lucky to be annoyed or to feel anything at all, since that was a very close call. I had to go stay with my parents and get back on my feet enough to go back in the wild, but I did do another 5 or 6 months off the grid after that. So I guess I can't say that either Bigfoot or Dogman scared me off of camping. I just never camped in that forest again. World Series Wolfman, as told to and read by Peter Bernard. According to my grandfather, this story is true and took place on October 9th, 1957, as he and his father were on their way home from the 6th game of that year's World Series. It was the Yankees versus the Braves back before they moved to Atlanta. Back then, they were the Milwaukee Braves, and their star was Henry Aaron. The day after this, the Braves would beat the Yankees, and Lou Burdette would win the MVP for throwing 3 complete games and only allowing Mickey Mantle and the mighty Yankees 2 runs over 27 innings. But this was the night before, and the Yankees had just won Game 6 at home in the Bronx, forcing Game 7. My grandfather and his dad were jubilant and hopeful and excited as they drove home, listening to chatter on the radio. There was a lot of traffic heading north, and as they traveled back toward their home in Yonkers, the sky got darker and darker. Eventually, my grandfather made a decision to get off the highway and try to take a shortcut through some of the populated areas around there and rejoin the highway further up where traffic might be lighter. Now, I'm not really clear on exactly where they were driving, but logically, it would be somewhere between the Bronx and Yonkers. Looking at a map, I'm guessing that they may have gotten off in Kingsbridge or Riverdale, and possibly they ended up driving through or near Van Cortlandt Park. This looks like the greenest area on the map, so maybe that is where this actually took place. I wish I could call Grandpa up and ask him to fill in the details, but he's been gone for a while now. I'm glad I got to know him pretty well in his last few years, though, as he was a great guy with a lot of interesting stories to tell. Like he had a few ghost stories, and he had a missing time experience in the Brown Mountains when he was younger. But this was my favorite of his stories. This was the story about how he and his father saw an actual werewolf. Or, something that looked like what we would call a werewolf. We were hanging out one time watching my parents' collection of old VHS horror movies, and one of them had these werewolves in it that looked like dogmen. They had pointed ears and wolf-like faces and dog-like legs, but for the most part, they were furry humans. Grandpa got really weirded out by this movie, and he told me those kinds of animals actually exist. So the baseball stuff wasn't actually how we got into this. It was because of this movie, some 80s werewolf flick. Grandpa said he never thought of what he had seen as a werewolf at all, because that's not what werewolves looked like in the public imagination back then. He thought werewolves were something made up for the movies anyway. What he saw looked very real and very natural. It was the size of a bear, so at first that's what he and his dad thought they saw. They were driving down a forested road, now away from the traffic and driving in a lonely area. The thing was standing alongside the road. Dad said he was instantly terrified. It was so large, it almost looked like it could pick their car up, and it was just standing there, bizarrely, along the right of the road, staring forward. Grandpa said his dad sped up to pass the bear, but it made a sudden and shockingly fast move out into the center of the highway, and they could see by the manner of movement and body construction that this was no bear. It seemed to be a giant wolf, one capable of standing like a meerkat and even walking like a bear. Grandpa's father slammed on the brakes and was barely able to stop in front of the creature without hitting it. The animal wasted no time at all leaping on the hood of the car. Its face was pressed against the front windshield, and it was trying to get inside the car, apparently not understanding what glass was. My great-grandfather hit the gas and started swerving the car around the road, trying to shake the creature. Unable to get the wolf thing off his hood, he then sped the car up to a terrifying speed, just horrifying my grandpa, who could barely see where they were going over the wolf and was certain they were going to crash. Then his father hit the brakes, and the wolf-headed bear did a tumble right over the windshield and the car roof, rolling down off the trunk and onto the highway. The two sped off, and that was the end of their encounter. Grandpa said it ruined the good mood they had been enjoying, and he sat kind of numb through the game the next day, which they also had tickets for. That time, the Yankees lost 5-0. They played like a Dogman had scared them too. On the way home from that game, Grandpa and his dad stayed right on the highway with all the traffic, not wanting to be on a lonely tree-lined road in the Bronx of the 1950s at night ever again. Dogman Dynamite, as told to and read by Peter Bernard. When I was a teenager, I worked for a few months at one of the last independently owned coal mines in the United States. This was back in the 1960s. I was working with my uncle, deep in the mine, down a number of levels, and for some reason, We were blowing a wall up. I was terrified to be that deep under the ground, and I was whispering because I was afraid of cave-ins. These guys, on the other hand, were talking about blowing the place up. Anyway, the operation went as planned, and as they had suspected, we found a new tunnel on the other side. It had a strange odor to it, that new tunnel did, and one of the men asked aloud if it were gas. I knew it wasn't gas, but I was trying to remember what it did smell like. Then someone else said it, just as I realized it. It was an animal smell. The tunnel we blasted into, deep under the earth, had the smell of a very large animal wafting from it. We hadn't identified it at first because there aren't supposed to be any animals living down here. At least, nothing large, mammalian, and smelly. Some of the men wanted to go up and report everything and send the next crew down to deal with this. I was very much in favor of that idea, but my vote didn't count. One of the men used the word Tommyknocker, which I had never heard before. Nobody explained the meaning to me that day, but judging by the mix of reactions, from horrified to skeptical among the workers, I guessed it must be a mythical underground monster that some of the men believed in, while others did not. Me? I believe in all monsters. If I had known there were supposed to be monsters this far underground, I think I would have gotten a job delivering newspapers or something instead of this job. It was not a career for me like it was for my uncle. I moved before I was 20, and I've worked in offices for the most part since then. And nobody in the mine that day thought I was going to be there for more than a couple or 3 months. For this reason, my opinion didn't count, and I wasn't always fully informed about what was going on. Now the men were deciding our fate, and I had no say in the conversation. It was excruciating. While the men were talking, I thought I heard something coming from the other tunnel. I tried to get my uncle's attention but was shushed. I poked my head through to see what was there, and I was met with the most horrifying sight I can ever imagine seeing. It was a demonic-looking thing with smoke or steam literally coming from its nostrils. It had the face of a dog, but not a natural or normal one. It looked evil. It felt evil, and it smelled evil. It took a step toward me, eyeing me intently with yellow eyes. As it stepped closer, I could see it was a dog, but one that stood up and walked like a man. And if I were to compare him to a man, it would need to be an athlete. One of these modern super tall ones that hit 120-mile-per-hour home runs. He was definitely over 6 feet tall, and maybe if you included the pointed ears on top of his head, he might even have been close to 7 feet tall when standing fully upright. His eyes seemed to glow in the darkness, which is something I had never seen before. It was a lot like glow-in-the-dark stickers that are sometimes popular with kids, but instead of that green color, its eyes were a warm yellow. They really seemed lit from within, but I don't know for sure. They were the strangest eyes I had ever seen on any creature in my life, and really, I've never seen anything like them since then either. The way it looked at me, I couldn't tell if it was going to eat me, bite me, run away from me, or read Shakespeare to me. Its look was completely alien. I couldn't read its expression at all. Somehow, though, I got the overwhelming feeling that this was a creature from hell, a supernatural entity from a mythical realm. And those don't actually exist. It's gas, I told the others in panic. It's gas! I'm hallucinating a dog-headed man. At that point, the hallucination became a mass one as the Dogman burst through the remnants of the wall furiously. He eyed us each in turn, as well as regarding the hole we had blown. He seemed to be assessing the damages in much the same way a suburban homeowner might look at the mess your baseball just made of his picture window. In short, he looked annoyed. I would like to say we exited in an orderly fashion, but we climbed over each other to get in the lift. My uncle pushed me to the front, saying his brother would kill him if I got eaten by a Tommyknocker. I was crammed so tight in that metal box that I could hardly breathe. My face was pushed into the metal grating, and the marks of it remained on my forehead and cheek for the rest of the day. But what I saw with my eyes as we rose up out of that hole was burned into my memory for the rest of my life. I saw that Dogman, or Tommyknocker as they called it, I saw it absolutely destroying that group of men while they fought back in a pathetic and almost helpless fashion. It was like an elephant in a war with squirrels. They had no chance. The Dogman moved so fast that he could anticipate each of their actions and block it, even while making offensive maneuvers against some of the other men. It was 7 or 8 of them, but they were hopelessly overmatched. I got out of there alive, but I never saw my uncle again, and I was never the same person again myself. I don't know if Tommyknockers and Dogmen are the same thing, or if Tommyknocker is just a name for any monster seen underground or in caves. I just know that on that particular day, a monster attacked the group of men I was working with. They called it a Tommyknocker, but to me it looked like a canine, and a particularly savage and aggressive one at that. Unlike many canines, this one did not seem to be hunting in a pack. How could a creature live that far under the earth? What would it feed on? A predator that far below the surface would imply that there was also prey down in that environment, and therefore vegetation for the prey to survive on. I've never heard of any evidence surfacing, if you'll excuse the pun, that would indicate the existence of any other life form down that far. So, if it doesn't live and hunt down there, could the animal have been hibernating and awakened by our dynamite blast? Could it possibly travel for hours each day into the earth to live in privacy, then venture for hours daily back up to the surface to hunt for food? Talk about a long commute. The story of coming across the Dogman in the mine is so unbelievable that even I don't want to accept it, and I lived through it. If my uncle hadn't been lost in the attack, I still wouldn't believe it actually happened. Even though it doesn't make sense, even though it seems impossible, even though I can't comprehend how it could have happened, I know for a fact that it did happen. And for that reason, nothing in the world has really ever made sense to me ever since.
Do you have a scary story you want us to read on the show? Just call our voicemail hotline, 804-LIST-SCARY. That's 804-537-2279. And now for something completely scary.
Dogman chased me on my bike, as told to and read by Peter Bernard. My family wasn't the richest, so about a year after I asked for a 10-speed bike, my parents were finally able to afford one. This was the late 1970s. I was in my mid-teens. Immediately, I was able to get a newspaper delivery job. Do those jobs still exist? and I was able to get a job in town sweeping the drugstore since I could ride my bike both ways. Mr. Flegel at the drugstore was always coming up with jobs for me to do around the shop so that he would have an excuse to pay me a little more money each week. The store had been around since before even Mr. Flegel was born, as he was the third Mr. Flegel in the history of the establishment, or the fourth, something like that. He would have me clean up these areas in the back with boxes that had so much dust on them, I thought maybe I was going to find King Tut inside. So, one afternoon he and I got involved in a cleanup job in the basement that was interrupted by a water main bursting and us rescuing boxes and things from the cellar as it flooded. When the plumbers came, Mr. Flegel sent me home, but it was nearly dark by then. I called home, and my mother said she'd come pick me up, but I had my bike, and it was just a 15-minute ride, so she agreed to let me bike it as long as I came home right away. So, of course, I went in the opposite direction of home first. I had to get a comic book, you see, and a pack of baseball cards before I went home. I meant to get them earlier, but the basement got flooded. It would only be a minute or two out of my way. When I got to the store, some of the kids that I knew from school were in an argument about who would win in a fight, the Hulk or the $6 Million Man. One of them said Steve Austin would use his superior test pilot mind to defeat the Hulk, while the other kid said the Hulk would rip Steve's bionic arm and leg off, then beat him to death with them. They asked me to decide which of them had the better argument. I thought about it, and I told them that it would depend on the circumstances. I could imagine either of those guys winning, but each of them would have to have a different advantage or disadvantage depending on the scenario. You get the idea. I didn't get started to home till it was really dark out. I was about 6 or 7 minutes into the ride home. During this stretch of nothing on either side but trees and trees for as far as you could see, when I started to rethink the idea of having my mother come pick me up. This was not the fun ride that it was during the day. In fact, I was getting kind of creeped out and paranoid. The crickets were so loud, and the trees were so all-surrounding that I felt as though something was going to jump out at me every second as I sped along. I stopped the bike in the middle of the road and tried to think. Where was the closest payphone? These were the days before cell phones. I'd probably have to go all the way back into town. I didn't want to do that. Plus, I'd get in trouble if I called her from the same place I had called her from almost an hour prior. I figured I'd better just keep heading toward home, when suddenly something ran out of the bushes directly toward me. My exact paranoid fantasy had come true, and this was not a nut job or a homeless person or something like that. This was either a large animal or a guy in a King Kong costume. It was hairy and the size of a man, and I took off on my bike, pedaling as hard as I could without ever having gotten a decent look at the thing. I pedaled and I drove, my back tickling as I could imagine how close the thing was. Might it be a rabid dog? A bear? What was the fastest thing it could possibly be, I wondered. This was a practical thing to wonder, as I really wanted to get some distance between me and it before turning around and trying to see what it actually was that I was racing away from. If it turned out I was running from Bambi, then this would all be a big LOL, but in that moment, I might have a rabid predator about to bite me on the back of the neck if I slowed down. So I didn't. Slow down, that is. Not for some while. It had to have been several minutes later when I was certain I hadn't heard any strange noises or heavy breathing or anything chasing me for some time. I slowed the bike down and pulled off to the side to catch my breath. I looked behind me, and I swear to you, maybe 400 feet behind me and gaining fast was a hairy man with a dog head. The tongue was hanging out of that guy's mouth like a dog with its head hanging out the window of a car. It had a determined look on its face, and it had its hungry eyes focused on me. It was a wolf, but it was running like a man, and its body was a mix of a wolf and a man. It was a remarkable thing to see, very graceful, yet also deadly. I knew this meant my death, and yet I stared for a second or two longer than I really needed to. I just wanted to drink it in. All that time I had been bicycling, and that thing had only lost 400 feet on me. Any second, it would catch up and eat me. So I raced the bike home. The creature didn't follow me into town as far as I know. My mother was waiting in front of the house to scold me in public. I never enjoyed her annoying personality so much before. The Dogman wasn't going to come near as long as she was shouting humiliating things at me. Ha! My mother probably made the Dogman feel sorry for me. But I guess she was right to yell at me that time. I could have gotten myself killed. And even after I grew up and got myself a car, I still avoided that one lonely highway after the sun went down. 'Cause that highway is the turf of the Dogman.
The Urban Exploration Dogman Story, as told to Peter Bernard, read by Madeline Starr. My husband and I used to like doing the urban exploration thing back before we were married. We mostly did it with fairly organized groups in the beginning. Toward the end of our Urbex period, though, we started going alone, just the two of us, into places we hadn't really researched as thoroughly as we might have. Because we had been lucky and never had any trouble, we had started to feel all-powerful. We got reckless, and we were unprepared. Of course, nobody is ever really prepared to go urban exploring and come across a Dogman. We had decided that we would check out that abandoned mental hospital in Brownsville, Pennsylvania. There are photos of it online. It looks like a horror movie. We thought it would be fun to walk through a real-life horror movie. We probably didn't deserve to be as lucky as we were that night. If I were you, I would not try something like this. The interior of this place had just been left as is when it closed in 1985, so it had all been decaying and gathering dust ever since then. There are rumors of ghosts. Given the terrible conditions reported here over the years, I'm sure a lot of human drama played out inside those walls. Once we were there, it didn't feel like a fun place to go anymore. It felt like we were disrespecting the pain of a lot of people, most of whom never did anything wrong to anyone. I could tell my husband wasn't as happy as he thought he would be either. We had come all this way and were both the types to finish what we start, so we pressed on as though everything were fine. Some of the hospital is decrepit, but other parts are actually collapsing. There's one hallway near the exterior where the wooden walls are so eaten away that you have to walk around and through piles of what looks kind of like sawdust. Maybe you carpenters or termite experts can explain that to me. All I know is it was gross, and I really wanted to get out of there as soon as we were inside. For some reason, and against my better judgment, I said nothing when my husband suggested we climb upstairs. I guess I sensed we were both scared, so it would make more sense to be a good exploring partner and accept that this was happening. It was no longer something I was doing for kicks. I just wanted to make sure we both got out of here the way we came in. When we got to the second floor, I heard a strange noise from the distance. I was trying to remember what the sound reminded me of when my husband asked if I could hear that. I asked him, "What is it?" And he said, "It sounds like a big dog with long claws walking around on a hard floor." I was trying to form words that might suggest we leave the premises when, as if on cue, that dog my husband referred to walked around the corner down the hall and stared at us. This was a huge animal. It had to be 4.5 feet high at the shoulders. I guess it was a sheepdog, but its fur was longer and stringier than I'd ever seen a sheepdog. This animal was filthy, and I didn't like the way he was eyeing us. It was not at all friendly. My husband quietly suggested we back off slowly, and I could hear the dog begin to growl. I made a suggestion quietly. "Let's back off slowly, more quickly." The dog decided for us as it reared back on its hind legs and stood up like a bear, rising to a ridiculous height, grazing its head on the ceiling. Little pieces of paint and dust fell from the ceiling onto him and all around him on the floor. It wasn't a dog at all. It was the Pennsylvania Dogman. Abandoning all strategy, my husband and I raced to get out of the building. We didn't think the creature was following us until we got to the sawdust hallway and heard a terrible crash only about 20 or 30 feet behind us. We screamed and fell face first into sawdust and kept screaming and running until we were out of that building. After that, we just kept running until we were in our car. The entire ride home, I was looking behind us and my husband was asking if it was following us. We were so shaken up by the experience. We genuinely were concerned that this thing might follow us to where we lived, dozens of miles away. For weeks afterward, he kept sending me email links to articles about dogs tracking people 500 miles and 1,000 miles. I made him stop it, and eventually he calmed down about it. So this was not an experience that made either of us want to go out hunting cryptids at all. You won't see us on a Sasquatch expedition. This experience taught me and my husband that there are areas in the world where we are not welcome. And most especially, we learned to respect the turf of the Dogman.
Dogman drank from my swimming pool. As told to and read by Peter Bernard. Dear Scary Stories NYC, you have stories on your show about people trying to decide if Dogman is a real animal or some kind of mystical mumbo-jumbo hooey. I can answer the question for all of you once and for all. Dogman is a flesh and blood animal. How do I know this? Because I saw him drinking from my swimming pool. Let me backtrack a bit. My wife and I moved into her parents' home when they both got committed to an old age home. We're not committed, but whatever it's called. Anyway, we got their home, which is way out in the middle of nowhere but a nice piece of property. We decided to put in a swimming pool in the back and make it a place we could really enjoy. The closest neighbor is I think over a mile away, so we planned on taking advantage of our privacy and staying in or near the pool a whole lot of the time. Almost as soon as we filled it up with water, though, there was trouble of one sort or another. Every time we would try to relax, we would hear sounds in the trees or the brush that would freak us out. We had no fencing around the place at all since we didn't think there was anything out there we had to be afraid of. We had sort of enjoyed the idea of being right there in nature. We didn't really understand what nature was. One day, nature came for a visit, and it wasn't cute and cuddly. Okay, what happened was this. I was up early that morning. I don't remember why. I was just randomly up early. So I decided to go out and do some maintenance on the pool. There had been some leaves and junk in it the night before, and I wanted to fish them out and check the chlorine levels, that sort of thing. So I had this pole with a net on it with me, and I strolled innocently out to the pool when I saw it. Something furry was at the other end of the pool, low to the ground, but clearly a large creature. My first thought was not, this is a dog or this is a bear, but my first thought was, this is a monster. At first glance, it looked like a giant furry centipede drinking water out of the pool. It was disgusting to see. Then, it lifted up its dog or wolf-like head, and I wondered if this was some kind of canine. But I had never seen any wolf or a coyote moving the way this thing moved. Could it be a chupacabra, I wondered? But then it reared up on its back legs somehow, really gracefully, but still horribly. It just looked so wrong there, like something that shouldn't exist. I can fully understand why someone would see one of these things and assume they were supernatural or paranormal or even a hallucination. But I know this was a real living, breathing animal because I saw it drinking from my pool water. Supernatural creatures don't need to drink, and if they do, it's not going to be chlorinated pool water. This was an animal, plain and simple. It was just the ugliest and strangest animal I had ever seen. And also the tallest. It had to be over 8 feet when reared up like that. I didn't hear it make any noise. It didn't growl. It didn't snarl. It didn't bark. It didn't even pant like a dog would normally do. It just kind of stared at me with these dead eyes, and I knew I was being told to back off. So I backed up a step or two, but for some reason, the creature charged me anyway. I defended myself with the pool net stick thing and managed to deflect his charge. Then I just ran like crazy back to the house and inside. I don't think he followed me, because he definitely would have caught me. The speed and size of that thing was so impressive in both cases that I was completely at its mercy. I could only assume it wanted me to get away, because it's not like I'm a ninja fighter or anything. This was pure luck. We immediately contacted people about putting in an electric fence around the part of the property that we mostly live in. Just outside the perimeter of the fence are trap cameras every 20 feet. It's been a while, and we have only caught birds and deer and raccoons so far, but I remain confident that sooner or later, that Dogman is going to get thirsty for some of that sweet, sweet chlorinated pool water again. And when he does, I'll have proof once and for all that the Dogman is a real, living, breathing animal. Dogman on the fence. This happened in the late 1960s when I was a teenager. My mother sent me to the store for groceries, and I took a shortcut along a neighbor's wooden fence to the store. It was technically trespassing, but we were friends with the family and they were fine with us using their fence instead of traveling all the way around their property, which would have added another half hour to the walk in each direction. It was autumn, just around sundown when I walked to the store. I was rushing because I knew it would be closing time soon, and I made a lot of noise crunching the leaves under my feet as I walked quickly down there. Arriving 5 minutes before closing, the owner rolled his eyes and helped me get everything on my mother's list so he could close up and go home. He asked me if I needed a lift home since it wasn't that far out of his way, but I said no thank you. Boy, did I live to regret that decision. I started back the way I came, but now it was getting darker and already a bit harder to see. I would have to walk through a small woods at the end of this fence, and that was going to be darker still. So already I was wishing I had let the store owner drive me home. Plus, I hadn't anticipated that the paper bag everything was in would start to feel so heavy so soon. This was back in the day before plastic bags with easy-to-carry handles on top. The main innovation of those days was double bagging the paper bags, so I had to use both arms to carry this one bag of food. As I was walking along the wooden fence, I saw an optical illusion that made it seem that something was sitting on top of the fence down further, away from me. I kept walking home and stared at that dark spot. Was it the trees behind the fence creating the illusion of a shape? Or was something really there? I walked a bit further away from the fence to get a different perspective on the illusion, but no matter what angle I viewed it from, it still looked as though it were in the same exact spot. It appeared to be something about 2 feet wide and maybe 4 feet tall, somehow balanced on top of the narrow wooden fence. I rounded a slight turn in the fence and had to abandon the concept of that thing being an illusion. It really was there. But what could it be? It dawned on me. What else sits on a branch of wood? Birds. It must be a very large bird, maybe an owl? I decided to keep heading in the same direction, but give that big bird plenty of extra room once I got close enough to it. Then, when I was maybe 100 or 125 feet away from whatever it was, it grew taller. I gasped and literally fell back on my butt, managing to clutch the grocery bag through the entire fall. A package of butter hit me on the chin but fell back in the bag. I could see, laying there on the ground, that it wasn't an owl that had grown over 6 feet tall. It was a hairy monster with a dog head. I screamed and somehow managed to get on my feet and start running back in the direction I had come from without dropping anything. The monster dropped, though. He dropped to all fours and began trotting after me, still remaining on top of the wooden fence. It was growling at me and baring its huge fangs, but it wasn't trying to catch up to me, which it could have easily done. When I reached the end of the fence, I kept running until I realized it had stopped and was now sitting on the final fence post, just watching me, curiously. So I walked around the long way, paranoid the entire time at every single sound I heard in the bushes, at every single leaf that blew around. When I got home, I got punished for taking so long, and my mother didn't believe me that a wolf-headed monster had chased me. But why should she? I wouldn't have believed the story if someone had told me. So I have to say, I did not see the Dogman walk or run on its hind legs. I saw it stand bipedally. Then the next time I looked back at it, the creature had gone back down to all fours to trot after me. So maybe the creature only was able to stand on its hind legs as a threatening or possibly defensive posture to frighten off potential threats. I don't think it considered me prey since it let me get away. It only seemed to want me off its turf after dark, and I respected that wish. From then on, I would always leave earlier to run errands for my mom so that I could be home before dark. And it's all because of the Dogman on the fence. Thanks for watching till the end. If you liked what you saw, please consider clicking like on the video or sharing it with your friends and family that you think might also be interested. If you would like to see more of our work, please consider subscribing and hitting that bell icon next to the subscribe button so that YouTube will alert you when we put out a new video. To become a channel member and gain access to our special perks, you can click that join link under each of our videos. Another option is to join our PayPal subscribers club at peterbernard.com. You can join for as little as 99 cents on YouTube or $1.50 at peterbernard.com, and that gains you access to our weekly secret uncensored episodes. If you'd like to see our 21 hours of archives of uncensored Dogman stories, then please join at the $3 level or above. To get to watch our shows in advance of the public, please join at our $10 level. That gets you all the perks. If you join our channel memberships, You need to check our community page here on YouTube in order to get the links to the secret videos and other perks. If you're in the PayPal Subscribers Club, Peter will email you all the news and links himself. Once joining the PayPal Club, which is Peter's homemade club, please give him a chance to see that you've joined and to compose you a personal welcome email, as none of that is automated. But whichever you join, we'll name you an executive producer for the next available episode. Do you have a scary experience that you'd like to share with us? You can email us at scarystoriesnyc@gmail.com or call our Scary Stories voicemail hotline at 804-LA-SCARY. That's 804-537-2279. It's a Google voicemail box, so that means it keeps cutting off after every 3 minutes. If your story is longer than that, please keep calling back and we can piece it together on our end. Good night, and have a scary tomorrow.
Come back for more scary stories.